Hi everyone. In this video I would like to discuss a debate streamed by the Institute of Art and Ideas and entitled "Can Science Crack the Mystery of Consciousness?" On the discussion panel was Bernardo Kastrup, who is a quite famous analytical philosopher, physicist Carlo Rovelli, equally famous, and Patricia Churchland, also a philosopher. They debated some theories regarding consciousness, panpsychism, idealism, and so on. And I would like to listen first what their opinion and position is on the topic and then comment. Let us hear what they have to say.
Explanations, because we don't have a panel of 10 people that are not represented here. And I want to be fair to give this a little airtime. So I'm going to just mention 4 explanatory categories, at least there are this much, that are not represented here. And I want each of you to give whatever reactions you have to them, and it needs to be quick. So, as noted, Bernardo mentioned panpsychism, the idea that you need some sort of a fundamental aspect of proto-consciousness in everything and every particle in the universe. It's one. Dualism, which was Patricia mentioned, which is, of course, a historical favor that the mental and the physical are both real and distinct, which is long out of favor, of course. Then there's non-reductive physicalism, which has been gaining favor among some. And of course, Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory. So give me some reaction, whatever you think about these 4 categories.
I wonder why he keeps out of the equation also the analytic idealism, where Bernardo Kastrup is the main modern representative. But anyway, let's hear.
Those 4. So, Pat, you want to take a shot at those?
Oh, well, I'm prepared to believe things if you can show me an experiment or a whole set of experiments that suggests that what you're claiming is true. I mean, part of the problem with all of these things is that they are isms for which there are philosophical arguments, but for which there are no data. The panpsychists imply, of course, that everything, including electrons and cow pies and feathers, they're all conscious. And if you ask panpsychists what the data are, they say, in principle, there are no data. This is just a metaphysical position.
So I would comment on this because this is a typical objection that comes from physicalists. Churchland is, I would say, a physicalist or material, has a prevalently material understanding and point of view of what consciousness is. This is a typical objection of the physicalist side. What is your proof? What is your evidence? Okay, that's fair enough. Can we prove that mind, consciousness is not just a pure epiphenomenon of the brain, but that there's something more? I would say I cannot prove you this from a third-person perspective with an experiment, which even in principle, how can you create and set up such kind of experiment? But there are 2 things, first of all. First of all, can you prove me that you are conscious? You're not conscious? You're conscious? Are you? Really? Have you sentience? Do you feel pleasure and pain? Do you see colors? Or are you just a robot, a zombie that has no feelings? Prove it. Can you? So nobody is conscious, except me, of course. I'm the only one conscious. So you see, this is a line of reasoning. But I would also say another thing. Okay, fair enough. Who says that consciousness is more than a product of the brain has a burden of proof. But in what sense is a physicalist exempt from this burden of proof? her assumption, more or less unaware, more or less unconscious assumption, and also of those who see these videos, I guess, is that the burden of proof is on one side but not on the other. Yeah. Why should the physicalist be exempted from being from furnishing a proof, a decent proof, that consciousness is a pure epiphenomenon of a neuronal network in our brain, just brain function and nothing else? Can you prove it? What is the evidence for this? And I would also contend that there is a lot of neuroscientific evidence that indicates the contrary. And Bernardo Kastrup is going to give us one example, and I don't think even the best example, but there are many others we might eventually discuss.
So when there are no practical consequences, and I don't, for example, with regard to Bernardo's view, I don't see how adopting that kind of idealism has any impact on one's practical life. For example, if you walk your dog and your dog evacuates, do you pick it up or do you turn your back and say, well, you know, I can't see it, so it's not real. If it has no impact on your practical life, if there are no data for it, then you're just another person with an opinion.
So before we hear the answer of Bernardo, I usually make this simple example. When people come up, oh, okay, that's abstract philosophy, metaphysics, but what it is useful for? I would say that everything that what we make in our life, everything practical, what we call practical, useful, which is normally more or less implicitly connected with money and material stuff. But anyway, everything that we believe should have a practical application is always, if we are aware of it or not, consciously or unconsciously, there is always some sort of philosophical worldview, some sort of metaphysical assumptions. There are always some opinions. There's always some ideological backgrounds that leads you to do something. Everything that we do is always sustained by some sort of philosophy in the background, even if we are not aware of it. The best example that, I don't know if that's the best, but the example that I make frequently is take, for example, environmental issues, the problem of ecology, climate change, pollution, and so on. And how should we fix this problem? This is a practical problem, isn't it? And it needs and requires practical action. Humanity is compelled to do something. So now take two persons. One who looks at nature from a purely materialist point of view and sees in nature only a mechanical clockwork, a purely soulless, meaningless, purposeless, pitiless, deterministic clockwork and nothing else, where we and all what we call consciousness life is just complicated machinery that needs a purely physicalist and material intervention. Then see another point of view, someone who believes that nature is more than that, that there is, for example, I don't know, a cosmic consciousness, or if you would like to call it God or whatever, that is behind these things, that there is a spirit at work in nature and that we are part of that nature. We cannot separate us from that nature. And we have a spiritual view on it. Yes, it is a metaphysical view. Would these two persons tackle the problem of climate change, the environment, ecology, and so on in the same way? I doubt it. I would say that they would act very differently. And in my opinion, at least, those who have also spiritual view would tackle with the problem in a less technocratic way, not denying the importance of science and technology, but going also beyond it. And who has only this physicalist, materialist point of view would probably not go much further. And we need this spiritual point of view. That's at least my opinion. But in any case, the point that I want to make is whatever kind of metaphysics that we nurture, and also physicalism is a sort of metaphysics, we will act also at a very practical level in very different ways.
Okay,
And
Bernardo.
it's fun, but I don't see that I want to waste my time.
Bernardo, your reactions.
Okay, there are enormous implications behind physicalism, idealism, and the other isms that Patricia doesn't want to commit to. One, if idealism is correct and we are the associated processes of a broader field of subjectivity, when you die, your core subjectivity still exists. This is an enormous consequence. If our bodies are the images of our own mental processes, including the processes we cannot reach through introspection, through metacognition, then talk therapy is a much more significant avenue to healthcare. Making sense and integrating your own mental life can have direct physical effects, like the so-called placebo effect, for which we have no account today. So the consequences are enormous. And there are ways to distinguish between these things through experimentation, it's obvious. Until 2012, we thought psychedelics would light up our brain with brain activity. Today, we know they do exactly the opposite. They only reduce brain activity.
So here he is hinting at the fact that when you take psychedelic drugs and have very intensive inner subjective experiences, let's forget now if these experiences are true spiritual experiences or not or whatever, but you have a very intensive spiritual experience. From a physicalist point of view, you would expect that you have more brain activity, whereas the contrary happens, that the intensity of your experience anti-correlates with the intensity of brain activity, which is contrary to the assumption that a physicalist, a materialist would have. And this is more in line with what Aldous Huxley called the mind at large, and where he saw the brain as a reducing valve of a mind at large, that is a sort of cosmic mind. And that is when the brain is the filter that is the brain is reduced, we open ourselves to this mind at large, and therefore we have more intensive experiences. If this is a empirical neuroscientific evidence for something that goes beyond mind, okay, I see that this is debatable. I don't think this is the best example that one can make. As I said before, there are also better examples. I will not go into the details here now. Anyway, and interesting was also his practical example. If you have another metaphysical perspective of what human beings are, you would also practice a different kind of medicine that might be also more effective. And I believe this is true. This opens a completely different worldview and view on medicine and what we are at the physical and spiritual level. That's another good answer, I think, to the objection of the practical consequences.
It's something that is relevant. Or Carlo was talking about relational quantum mechanics, to which I agree. But the direct implication is that all physical entities do not have standalone existence. They do not have absolute existence. So that's a premise of physicalism, that physical entities.
He connects now a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, the relational quantum mechanics of Carlo Rovelli. And yes and no, I don't know if we can extrapolate from this interpretation something about ourselves, but in any case.
Do have absolute existence and then generate mental entities. And relational quantum mechanics contradicts that. And it has been, I would claim, proven by experiment for the last couple of years. Two major experiments, one by Proietti et al. and another one about Wigner's friend thought experiment that was done now as an actual experiment.
No, I don't think the Wigner's friend paradox tells us much more about that. I think these are, again, extrapolations. If someone is interested, you can read this up in my book on quantum physics, where I make a brief introduction on the measurement problem and the Wigner's friend paradox in the first volume, and you will see that, yeah, I would not make these far-fetched interpretations. But anyway,
show that Rovelli was right in that regard, and I would claim this takes the floor from underneath the feet of the physicalists.
Okay, Carlo, your reaction to some of those other ideas?
Thank you, Bernardo. I wish you were right, but I that there are experiments that prove relational quantum mechanics. I would be very happy, of course, if they were, but I don't think there are. No, I don't think it's a confirmation of relational quantum mechanics.
So you see, that's a typical. Also, there are a lot of people who extrapolate from quantum mechanics, from quantum physics, something about metaphysics. Yes, I do this as well, but I think we must be very careful not to mix things up together and conflate things, and sometimes things seem to confirm something, but we must be also very careful of our own bias and confirmation bias. And I think here Kastrup fall quite clearly in his own confirmation bias.
Let me go through your questions, Robert. Panpsychism, I just don't understand it because I don't understand what it means. In fact, I listen with attention what Bernardo says, but I don't understand what it means that everything is mental because I don't understand what mental means. I think that mental just means related to the complex phenomenology of things happening in me or in Bernardo.
So again, another problem that the philosophy of mind and consciousness studies have, this conflation between mind and consciousness. Mind is one thing, consciousness is something else. Mind is that what produces thoughts. Thoughts come and go, come and go, come and go. But there is a witness. Someone, something is witnessing these thoughts coming and going. And who is it? What is that? That's a subject, if you wish. Let's call it like that. But who or what stands behind the perceptions of this subject? It is consciousness. So consciousness is an immutable witness, whereas thoughts who come and go are the activity of the mind. And when you conflate these two things, then of course you cannot understand what is panpsychism, what does it mean that everything is mental. And that's the problem that we have in modern. Well, Rovelli is not a philosopher, he's not a psychologist, he's a physicist, but he is talking about something that he has a problem to understand because in the background there is this conflation.
But you know, that's part of nature. So the fact that I agree that there is no boundary between this and the rest of nature, but there's no boundary between a bicycle and the rest of nature. This doesn't mean that everything is bicyclist. Bicycle is just one of the things around in nature. And with respect to Patricia, I would say, yes, of course, data, but I'm a theoretical physicist. You don't do physics only with data. You do physics with data, but then a lot of work, theoretical work to develop good concepts to make sense of this data. So of course we have this data, we bring them together and we get ways of thinking about.
I would also ask him here again, what are the data that confirm physicalism? I have a lot of data that not disconfirm it, but suggest that physicalism might be wrong.
About
we need to go on. Thank you, Carlo. I think to conclude this first part is that consciousness does have a spectrum of radically different explanations. I think we want to leave everyone with that concept, that I think we're being presented here with perhaps some of the most common ones, but there is this spectrum, and ultimately, I guess only one can be correct. Our second theme deals with the hard problem of consciousness directly, and as an arguably unbridgeable gap that in principle separates physical events from mental experiences. And Bernardo, I want to ask you, you're king of this hill. So would there be any data, as Pat has been offering, that conceivably that could be discovered or experiments concluded that could falsify your position as an idealist and convince you that you are wrong and that Pat is right?
If we had absolutely no instances of circumstances in which brain activity decreases tremendously while inner experience increases in richness, in intensity, then that one way to construe that as indications towards something other than idealism. If we had reason to believe that all physical entities have absolute standalone existence, then that would also indicate that something along physicalist lines could be true. As it turns out, neither is the case.
I would add also another couple of things. First of all, I would say I would become a physicalist if you are able to prove with your data, with your experiments, that physicalism is true. So first, I would make the same objection that Churchland made at the beginning. But as neuroscientific evidence, I would, for example, cite the fact that if you cut your brain in two pieces, your subjectivity would be preserved. You can live quite well also with cutting the communication between your two hemispheres and preserve your identity. How can this be if the brain is produces our identity? Then one or the other hemisphere produces. Or I would also cite the fact that if mind and consciousness is a product of the brain, well, yes, but then how is it that also plants show to have some basal cognition, and even single cells demonstrate to have some basal cognition, which we could call a sort of proto-mind, something proto-mental, something a sort of primitive mind, but they don't have a brain. They don't even have neurons. A single cell is just a single cell. And here we see in nature that it suggests at least that mind and cognition might be something fundamental that comes before matter itself. I'm not saying that these things demonstrate it, but they suggest it, and they go decisively against the physicalist approach. Of course, you can save the appearances, as Kastrup now is going to say.
As it turns out, there are significant and growing empirical contradictions to physicalism today, and physicalism is reacting through the traditional epicycles, through all kinds of changes and additions and tortuous models to try to accommodate the anomalies. And we know how that story goes, and we know how it will end.
Exactly. Here I agree with Kastrup 100%. I also use very often this analogy, the metaphor of the epicycles. We are again in a historical situation where we try at any cost to save the paradigm, the geocentric paradigm, and we don't like to give it up. And so to explain the anomalies, we add epicycle to epicycle and make the series with an ever increasing complexity. And yes, we know how this will end. I think we are going to the demise of the materialistic conception, reductionist, or at least the conventional orthodox point of view.
Carlo, some would use quantum mechanics to literally generate consciousness. You said you reject that concept. I'd like to know why. Famously, Roger Penrose and Stu Hameroff, with their orchestrated objective reduction, think within cells that quantum mechanics is needed in order to explain consciousness. Murray Gell-Mann famously used the phrase a quantum flapdoodle to dismiss all sorts of uses of quantum mechanics that to other topics that he thought were inappropriate.
I don't dismiss this attempt a priori. I don't think they're silly, totally, and useless. I think it's good that somebody looks at that. Everything is quantum mechanical, right? The reason an atom stays together is quantum mechanical. The interaction between molecules is quantum mechanics. In a sense, I'm everything quantum mechanical. But I've looked at these specific proposals, Roger Penrose, others, and I'm not convinced that those works, and I don't see the need of that.
Here we have the need. There is no need to believe in this or that. Yes, that's true. If your background belief, your worldview, your assumptions are of a certain type, then you will not feel a need to believe in something else. If your worldview is different, then you will feel the need for that. And in the case of quantum mechanics, is that nobody, Roger Penrose would deny this vehemently. I'm pretty sure about that. But I think at the end of the day, the real reason why people like to put quantum mechanics into the brain functions is because inwardly we feel that it has something to do with something that goes beyond physics, beyond physicalism, beyond matter. Quantum mechanics, and especially quantum indeterminism, can save us from a strict, soulless, purposeless, deterministic, mechanistic worldview, I mean. Yeah. And if you believe in a mechanistic worldview, you don't need this. You don't feel it to be necessary. If you don't believe in a completely mechanistic universe, well, yeah, you feel perhaps that it might be useful, quantum mechanics in this sense. So you see, we believe in things according to our backgrounds, assumptions, and metaphysical views. Everyone is so. It's useless to deny it. The important point is that we are aware of that, and frequently these people are not aware of this.
Quantum phenomena disappear as soon as there is a sufficient macroscopic number of degrees of freedom heat. So I don't, it seems to me that we're going to make sense of what happened in our mind in terms of, the complexity of the many things that happen. We have a tendency when there are different strange things to connect them. Maybe the strangest of this is connected to the strangest of that. Sometimes it's work, but I don't see indications that that's the case. I see, if I might add one thing, a perspectival, let me make this simple analogy here. What is a sunset? A sunset is the sun going down and disappearing in the, plunging in the ocean or disappearing behind the hill, right? And then somebody comes in and says, no, wait, that's all wrong. There's a story behind sun. There's a physical story behind the sun. You're sitting on a spinning rock and the sun doesn't move at all. The sunset is just what happened when you're rotating from the lit to the dark part of the rotating stone on which you're sitting. Have we changed dramatically, substantially what a sunset is? No, we're just giving a better understanding of the same thing. We're talking about something. There are different perspectival description of the same phenomena at a different level of complexity and understanding. There's no contradiction whatsoever between the two. So I think when we understand something, this is what's going on. We have a perspective on something, okay? Think how perspectival this sunset, nothing happened to the sun. And we have a better account of what is going on. I think we're going to get something similar with consciousness, a better account with what is going on, which makes sense of our perspectival perception of it without any contradiction between the two.
Yes, and I agree with him. And I would say we will go so far that we will put together all these theories in one synthesis of knowledge, in one synthesis, in a one theory that contains them all, but is none of them. Physicalism, materialism is not wrong in itself, but also panpsychism is probably perhaps not wrong. And idealism is also not wrong. And these are 3 points of view, perspectives, that can be brought together, but not as a sum that make a whole. We can say they can coalesce together and emerge in something that is completely different and yet contains them all. But Rovelli, Churchland, and I suspect also Kastrup, they are not willing to do this, even though Rovelli says that he perceives intuitively that we are going in this direction. And this, I believe, he is quite right in this. But anyway, those are my thoughts. If you want to see this video entirely, unfortunately it's behind a paywall, but it sounds very interesting. You can find the link in the description. And as I said, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comment section below if you wish. And if you found the video interesting, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon if you didn't do so already. Thanks a lot for listening.